All right, here we are. We are live with my friend Chris Fenster. And Chris, you and I have known each other for quite a while, since you were down in Dumbo when I first started the fund, which is now
Yep.
14 years ago.
Wow.
And first of all, thank you for coming on and spending the time with us. And this is a topic that I have heard you talk about a lot. And it really comes down to a lot of times people think about startup hires as good or bad hires. And in particular, in this finance stack of people and technology, your position, and tell me if I've got this, is that a lot of the time, it's not good or bad person. It's rightness of fit that is very stage dependent, that the nature of the tasks in the finance stack change over time in ways that people don't get right.
Yeah. The premise for the work that we've been doing for the last 17 years was that there actually isn't a way to get this right if you're subscale. It's almost impossible to solve a systemic subscale problem if you don't have scale. And this is that.
And what do you count as
So
scale?
put it this way, it's not difficult to build a finance team if you can hire 4 or 5 U2 people because you get specialization where you need it. You've got the resources, but
A
what does that
receivables
cost?
person and a leader and,
Or even, let's break it down into its sort of simplest blocks. You need competent, efficient bookkeeping. You need some level of controllership, which is more specialized leadership, compliance, systems and process, accounting focused. You need some level of foresight, budgeting, planning. A lot of people think that's CFO work, but it's not. Like any really competent analyst from an investment bank can build a financial model. And then you need the leadership. And, it's sometimes really hard conversations and sometimes, strategy and focus. Do we raise enough money? But it's complex. And when you can afford one person, let's say you can afford $100,000 a year, what should you do? Like you can't hire all 4 of those people. So you hire a generalist, right? You start with a Swiss Army knife and somebody who is proficient at many things. And that's usually the right move, but we all know what's going to happen. You go from you raise 10 million on a 50 pre, and now your hurdle is in 25 million on 100 plus in 24 months. Like, how are you going to do that with a utility person? You can't do it, right? So
but
it's a scale problem.
4 or 5 W2 people and that kind of budget for a team, we're talking about a company that is doing tens of millions of dollars in revenue. I know a lot of times founders think about when we get to scale, Series A, maybe we're doing $3 million, but this is Series B, C. So you're talking about this problem is systemic. Really, anybody who probably hasn't even raised a B yet.
But totally. Yeah. You're paying $500 a month for bookkeeping. You just got to think about this. Like by the time you get to that Series B, let's work backwards from what a scale solution looks like, right? 4 or 5 W2 people, that might be a 9-figure run rate, right? And you're spending 700 grand a year. So let's just say that that's sort of what the sort of perfect world scaled solution looks like. Now you got to work backwards to wherever you are. I'm spending $500 a month and it's not great, but like it doesn't matter. And my resources are better invested in customers and product and right. So these are perfectly rational decisions, but somehow you have to bridge this over the course of the
You
next
got to get
several
from A to
years.
B.
Yeah, I got to get from A to B. Like, what am I going to do? So I think the systemic problem is sort of it's impossible to put a scalable solution in place for less than a certain amount of money. Let's call it $250,000. It's a lot, right? Like you can hire a couple people that are pretty good, you know, you start with a utility player, Swiss Army knife person, and then over time you can upgrade to certain specialist roles. And that's kind of how the game is played. But, unless you know that that's how the game is played, it's really easy to set yourself up for failure, which is
Gotcha.
what a lot of companies do.
So let's talk about setting ourselves up for success. and will be pointed with a handful of questions. So what am I actually trying to solve with my initial hire, right? I'm going from A to B. I've got some fractional small time $500 solution, and hopefully I'm building to these like 4 people. At some point I'm going to get a person. So what am I trying to solve for in that first senior finance hire?
Yeah. For a lot of founders, it's accountability. I don't have the time or the skills or the experience to deal with this challenge as it moves from sort of a nuisance to something more important. And I just need somebody else to be responsible. Right. Like that's often the mindset. And it's not an unreasonable point of view, but often it's compounded by some sort of a problem, right? There's an inflection point. You sort of underinvest in this stuff for as long as you can get away with it. And then something happens that, elevates it. And maybe it's a good thing. Like you do a institutional fundraise and now you've got a board and some, you know, people that are demanding professionalization. But it could also be you botch an audit or you have to restate your revenue because, you weren't recognizing it the right way. And now your board is on your back. And so it is very often a defensive situation. Like I underinvested, I was accumulating this sort of accounting debt, went sideways. Like now I gotta deal with it. Right. So I think the desire for accountability is totally rational. I think the actual problem that you're solving for can have a lot of variability to it. Uh, if it might be controllership style problems where the accounting just isn't right. It might be foresight style problems where you just don't have great visibility into what's coming. It might be credibility and strategy problems where the board just really wants somebody embedded in the business that's going to be a good partner to the founder. And then there's a lot of nuance behind that. You know what I mean?
So when you actually do wind up making that first hire, there's a complexity point in which even a really good first hire, things will break. And in the real world, where have you seen that first hire? Where do things break?
that's a good question. It can break, and it does break in a lot of different ways, a lot of different places. I think that the first thing to point out is that the breakage can occur from underperformance or overperformance. And in fact, those first finance hires, you'll get the most longevity out of your first finance hires if you have like slower than planned growth. So things go okay, not great. Because it's they're utility players. How long can you use a Swiss Army knife? Like if you really need a chainsaw, the Swiss Army knife isn't going to cut it, right? So it's like, you can get a fair amount of runway if things go okay, not great. If you outperform the um, the sort of vulnerability on the high end starts to really increase. Now your business it's performing at plan, and you just need more strategic horsepower, and you need stronger accounting. And now you're going to get a first audit, and there's a ton of compliance, transaction readiness, all sorts of things can create complexity on the upside. And by the way, like you can attract way better talent than you could attract when you're making that utility hire. So those are your upside problems. Your downside problems are, where our product isn't performing as planned, and we hired a bunch of people after we did that first institutional raise, and like turns out we can't really afford them, and it's not working out. We're not hitting the revenue number. Like there are just some hard conversations that need to happen. And the utility player who's never had to have a hard conversation with a founder is just not going to be in a position to make those calls. And that's really what the business needs. And you might say, oh, well, the board is going to do that. And like, yeah, sometimes, maybe not. I mean, you sat on a bunch of boards, like
Yeah,
you've seen this play
I
out,
wouldn't
right?
count on the boards. No.
No, it just isn't going to happen. And so, look, maybe that person is not also your utility player. Like maybe you do the right thing by hiring a utility player, but as long as you have clarity about what they are and what they aren't, and you can fill some of those seats maybe with other advisors, like you can give yourself some flexibility. But there are a whole bunch of different failure modes for this. And it starts with sort of good problems and bad problems. And they're all problems. But then they can delve into sort of accounting problems or finance problems or system problems or, opportunity costs, things like that.
Well, one of the things that I sort of think about, just to put a fine point on it, oftentimes where you feel like you need a full-time finance person, particularly in a place like New York, we tend to dive into the pool of, banker who wants to join the startup world, right? Like your buddy from your MBA class, and she's coming out of Goldman or whatever. She has the tools, the spreadsheet skills, the financial modeling skills to understand a business, right? But has never been in a tough startup board conversation, right? So she can track everything, right? But it would take, she's not necessarily an accounting systems expert, and she's not necessarily a strategic budgeter for a company of this size, and hasn't gone through a fundraising process with this level of growth. Like there's all sorts of things where you've effectively put a band-aid on a bunch of different areas, but you're not getting um, the experience, because you're not at the point where you can hire a startup controller, who's been a part of a growing company, who can put in control systems in place, hasn't been a, forecaster specifically for a company at this stage. That being said, if you can't hire the experienced startup expert in each of these spots, and listen, like, you obviously have a perspective, because I'm sure part of the answer is, well, you should hire somebody like Propeller. But you often work where there are teams, full-time teams in place and at scale, where there might be one of the different, hopefully at some point 5 people, and then a firm like yours. So I'm curious as to, like, do you have a perspective as to, like, who do you get first? How do I know if I need a VP of finance first, controller first, uh, somebody with a CFO title? Do you have a prescribed, like, first you hire this person, then you hire this person, and then for whatever you don't have, you use a fractional firm? Or is it really differ on the type of company, or the strengths of the people you find in market?
So don't want to answer. It depends. I think there are some predictable patterns that emerge, and you have lots of different options, right? Like, do I go with a controller person, or do I go with a ex Goldman Sachs person? Or uh, I think the first thing that's helpful is just defer it. Just defer it for as long as you can. The quality of the talent that you're going to attract, the knowability of the role, the stability of the business, anything that you can do to defer those U2 hires is going to be really helpful. And to that end, I think recognizing that just because you outgrew your $500 a month bookkeeper doesn't mean that you outgrew bookkeeping or outsourced or fractional or whatever, people are calling it. Like, maybe you just need a better partner. Um, and as I was saying before, I think just understanding that um, you're going to go through these different stages, and that each stage brings with it some really particular complexities. Like, if you think about it from sort of launch to traction to early scale to late scale, like, you're resource constrained in the first three of those stages. Like, you're building things that are intentionally sort of patchwork solutions because they're cheap and they're fast and they're flexible. And, the person from Goldman Sachs may not understand this framework, like this paradigm. The controller might get you a high level of accounting precision, but a substandard level of foresight. I think just being aware that your needs are going to change pretty dramatically 3 or 4 times in the sort of pathway between sort of bookkeeping and, let's call it, 9-figure enterprise value makes it a
So
little
it
bit
sounds like you're really
easier for you to find a
optimizing for
stage specific solution.
it sounds like you're really optimizing for flexibility without trading off quality.
Yeah. Or just, it's like planned obsolescence. Don't think that the W2 person that you hire, after your Series A needs to be or should be the W-2 person that you have at a Series D is not almost never. And when it does happen, it usually has some really particular circumstances behind it. It's so rare. It's so rare for even just an accounting leader to make the transition into finance leadership. So, but just being aware that this is happening kind of lets you set up, let's call it like modular solutions. So to get back to your question, like if I'm hiring a finance director, that's a generalist role. A controller is a specialist role. A finance director is a generalist role. That's somebody who you kind of expect to still have sort of the Swiss Army knife skill set. You can layer around that person. You can have, a fractional CFO come in and supplement that person. They're coachable. They know that they're coachable because they got a director title, right? There's some optics around this. It gives you this level of flexibility. You hire a finance VP. That's a specialist role. It's a finance specialization role. They may not have all the chops that they need for controllership, but that's something that we can regularly provide, or firms like ours. Like there are a lot of different ways to get that level of accountability. And then if the company shoots the moon, you can bring in a super experienced CFO. You can layer that person and you can hire them with the expectation that, if things go well, they'll have a long career. If things go really well, they'll get to have a voice in, selecting a boss, like a world-class CFO. I so regret, by the way, not ever taking a job working for a great CFO. I would have learned so much faster than I did just, school of hard knocks, banging my head against the wall just to figure things out. I liked it and I was good at it, but, let's be honest, really great coaching and mentorship would have been great for my career. I mean, never started Propeller, but it would have been much better for my like earning power and career growth. So I think just planning for that, building modular, flexible type solutions, because you recognize that the company's going to go through these different stages and, flexibility is going to be an asset is the first thing to understand. From there, it's usually not that difficult to say, okay, which of these different stages are you at? What are the today problems that need to be solved? Like go solve for those. But to the extent that you can avoid, um, you know, putting in, sort of enterprise grade solutions to sub enterprise grade problems, like you're going to save yourself a lot of hassle.
So oftentimes, early stage founders find someone where they feel like they can't afford to pay them commensurate with their experience. And so they overtitle them, or they give them a title that actually does match their experience. And they
Mhm.
say, listen, I'm lucky to have this person. And the only way I can get them on, because there's no way they're going to come from, used to be VP of finance at Series D company to my company unless I give them the CFO title or something like that, right? And aren't I planning to grow into a big company anyway? So what's the downside if I give someone this C-level finance title early? And what kind of problems am I locking myself into 12 to 24 months later?
I think the biggest one is that layering is effectively off the table. If you want to bring in somebody with more experience, you can't without demoting that person or just
You're stuck.
creating bad optics. Yeah, and it's kind of an unforced error. I mean, somebody either is a CFO or they're not, right? And you obviously can't plan for everything, but if you're just throwing out numbers, if you're paying somebody 150 grand a year and you're calling them a CFO, they're not a CFO. And by the way, your board knows this. I mean, you've seen this. I don't need to tell you this. It's just creating some risk for you as a founder. It's setting up a future hard conversation. And I think the other thing is that it can make an otherwise coachable person a little bit less coachable. Hey, I've already got my stripes. I don't need you to tell me how to do this. I'm a CFO. I think the really good ones will have imposter syndrome in there, and they'll work their butts off to try to go get coaching and mentoring and rise to the occasion. Not all of them do, but it doesn't do that much. You're optimizing to get somebody to yes who would not otherwise take the job. But what does that commit them to? It commits them to the title. It doesn't actually commit them to the job that the business needs them to do, which is just ultimately not a great alignment.
So when you wound up outgrowing that first person, What does a clean transition look like? Like, how do you preserve some of that knowledge that people have about how things were set up before without creating a lot of friction in the business? I've heard, I can't tell you how many startup employees I've heard saying, well, things have changed because they brought in this new finance person and it's morale changing to some extent. And I'm curious if you've seen good transitions happen.
Yeah. I think this is sort of yet another opportunity to just say, look, if you assume that you're going to have a handful of transitions over the next couple of years, what are you doing differently? Like if you're building a resilient finance function, if you assume that there is a high probability that your leadership or other roles on the team might turn over, what are you doing differently? Well, I think you're doing a bunch of things. Like you're creating some redundancy, you're creating a lot of transparency, processes are documented, and you sometimes see that leaders, especially leaders that maybe don't have the experience, the security that comes with the experience, are creating some job security for themselves by keeping tons of stuff in their heads that can and should otherwise be documented. So it just creates a lot of risk. And then, in that kind of a situation, a lot of the knowledge walks out the door when you have your transition and then somebody else comes in and they have to build it from scratch and they've got their playbook and they use different systems. And now, you're upgrading to NetSuite, deploying a bunch of software and, those things shouldn't necessarily be attached to the leader. There's no reason not to document those things. Like one of the advantages of working with a hybrid team, which is sort of the way that we think about Propeller, like half of our new revenue comes from companies that are over 30 million in revenue, where we're just sort of playing support roles and long tail kind of work. And they have leadership, B2 leadership. We're playing sort of like we'll run a function. One of the first things we do is snap them into our grid. So you're using Ramp and you're using, I don't know, NetSuite. Like there are certain ways that we pay a bill using Ramp and NetSuite. And we really try hard not to do that, 40 different ways across 40 companies. Like that doesn't make any sense. So by standardizing as much as we possibly can, we create some efficiency. We create all kinds of opportunities for us to automate things, but we also create transparency. This is just sort of you can standardize a bunch of processes that are otherwise going to be individual snowflake processes living in some controller's head. And that person changes and a new person comes in and they just replace one snowflake process with a different snowflake process. There's no reason for that. It's one of the advantages of having sort of a hybrid workforce is you're creating redundancy, you're creating transparency. There's an inherent amount of efficiency in there. It's just one way to de-risk this. Yeah.
One of the things that I just find interesting, and I'll finish up by doubling down on your deferral point. The idea that as a firm that provides fractional, or as you call it, modular support, that half of your new business is coming from people who are doing 30 million or more in revenue, I think would surprise a lot of people because they imagine that when you get up to that level of scale, you're not doing this like fractional modular seems like early stage stuff. Now it's early stage compared to $200 million in revenue, but I think a lot of founders would assume by then I'll have a full-time person for everything. And the idea that I'm still doing modular, targeted, limited engagements is really deferring pretty far into the companies. And you're at 30, $40 million of revenue. And I wonder if you could just sort of speak to that and what you would say to a founder who would be surprised to hear that. And also a founder that maybe is getting pressure from their board to, hey, you just raised, you're doing $30 million of revenue. We just raised 20 or whatever the number, 50 or all that sort of stuff. Go spend, build infrastructure. Like we are building a big company here. Don't play around with this part-time stuff. This is a little different. Tell me what you say to those people about why it's important to maintain this flexibility and this modularity.
It's an opportunity to get the best of both worlds. I mean, when a board tells you to go hire the W-2 people, what they want is accountability, security, reliability, um, and you can afford it. They want you to understand the difference between an expense and an investment. They want you to be investing in the business that you want to have a year or two from now, right? Not just spending to manage the costs in the business that you have today. So much has changed in the last, I mean, it's been almost 18 years since we started the firm. And, if you'd told me that half of our new business was going to come from, you know, larger growth stage companies, I would have said, would have been very surprised. Like that was never the goal. But I think it's a consequence of the evolution of all of the systems and the technology and then probably a result of our experience hanging on for dear life as some of these companies were just accelerating, growing so fast that they just didn't have time to replace us. We just acquired more and more experience in larger and larger businesses. And eventually, asked ourselves the question like, why are our healthiest clients outgrowing us? And does that still need to happen? And I think what we learn, which is really starting to have more impact now as AI sort of proliferates into the stack, is that there's really no substitute for that accountability that the boards are demanding. Like you hire W-2 people for that. And sometimes you'll outgrow them, maybe more often if you're outperforming than if you're underperforming, as it happens. But if and when that happens, having some depth and flexibility and redundancy in your team can be really helpful. Not a lot of people have, like boards aren't saying, we need you to hire you know, a payables team. They don't care about that. And to be honest, like CFOs aren't great at, nobody wants to sort of invest the time to go perfect that. But the advantage of this sort of hybrid solution is a firm like ours can learn from all of these experiences over this length of time with the resources of, it's essentially building a scale solution for subscale businesses. We've got 250 people embedded in 300 companies that are doing 4 billion a year in revenue. And we're investing in automation, best practices and standardization, this whole snap to grid thing I told you about. Like that makes a ton of sense for us. And it's great with all the AI coming because, if we want to add an agent to a process and we've standardized that process across, 150 of our 300 companies, we can essentially just push it out. We know exactly where it's like an over the air update for a, self-driving, right? That's not something that individual companies are going to build anytime soon. So it's a way, I think, just to leverage kind of the direction of our firm organically that helps de-risk and build transparency and build redundancy without getting in the way of the accountability that boards and founders really need.
I mean, one of the ways to think about it is if you know your team is headed to the playoffs, some of the moves you make at the trading deadline are not big moves, actually. They're bench strength. They're, people who are going to play part-time roles and provide strong backups who might push the person in front of them to be a little better because they bring experience to the table. They're tweaks on the margin. They're not necessarily huge full-time hires. And I feel like that's a little bit, you might have a person in each of those 4 places, but a modular solution can make each of their lives easier, more strategic, and seamless when somebody gets pulled into something else, like a fundraising
Yeah.
or, rental leave or any of those
It happens
things
all the time, right?
where you don't want to skip
Yeah.
a beat.
Yeah. That's exactly right. It's exactly right. Not having to reinvent the wheel every time is a huge efficiency. It just creates so much stress and so much dependency on just sort of the individual's perspective. And a lot of that stuff just doesn't have to be that way. To your point, maybe it's in the margins. Like we're not white knighting inside any of these companies. We're just trying to learn from the experiences that we're having and build something that can get better as it gets bigger. So, systemic solutions instead of sort of individual contributor solutions, right? If we can solve something systemically, then we can leverage it and create value in a bunch of different places. And if we can do things because we have scale that the companies that we work with don't, great, huge value add.
Great. Well, listen, Chris, I really appreciate the time you've spent with us today. And propellerindustries.com is how to find you and your team. and some really cool content that you guys have put out there. And look forward to continuing the series. We'll be doing a webinar a month. Feel free to drop a line with questions and comments and help us guide this knowledge sharing journey that we're doing this year. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Charlie. It's great to see you. Appreciate it.
You too. Bye bye.